Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak here and the warm welcome that I have found from everyone here, including students in the hallway who helped me find this room. And thank you especially to our interpreters who have made this conference truly an international conference. So thank you so much to them. I am presenting today on Locating a Revolution, Germany's 1989. And by locating, I mean not only finding it politically or geographically, but also in terms of memory and in terms of historiographical considerations. And first, I want to start off with an anecdote to illustrate this complex problem. I have witnessed a number of celebrations this past month in the United States and Germany about the fall of the Berlin Wall or East Germany's peaceful revolution or any other kind of lovely sounding term that you can come up with. The theme is always similar. Some sort of wall is erected symbolically, perhaps with shoe boxes or with milk cartons or any other clever thing that you can come up with. Often covered with graffiti, which is a Western appropriation of the wall since it was impossible to put graffiti on the eastern side of the wall, interestingly. And then usually this wall is torn down at the end of a ceremony, often accompanied by a rock band covering Pink Floyd's The Wall. And this 25 years after the fall of the wall. This continued level of enthusiasm today is almost as expected, albeit far less important, as the original fall of the wall and its first heady days of optimism and general good feelings all around. Indeed, on its 21st anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, those of us who study 20th century German history have been in such high demand as speakers at these kinds of events that there is not enough of us to go around, a lament that I heard again and again as I turned down more invitations to speak this season than I have received combined over the entirety of my career. And of course, I accepted the best venue here in Prague. This rather unabashed party like it's 1989 has left me with the question, whose revolution, when we speak of the German Democratic Republic's 1989 peaceful revolution? It was never only about the GDR or the two Germanys or the Western Allies or Eastern Soviet satellites or the Soviet Union itself. Nor was it only about politicians' misplaced gambits to maintain power or about citizens demanding the right of self-rule. It was a complex mixture of all of these elements, and this is what I would like to discuss in this presentation. It is not my intent to cover all of the developments surrounding the collapse of the GDR and subsequent unification, or to provide definitive answers that the archives have yet to answer. Rather, I present here some talking points to provide further discussion and perhaps provocatively. Let's start for some context. Let's turn our historical gaze back westwards. In the 1980s, France began to worry about the Federal Republic's eastern drift. That is, the perceived tendency that West Germany was more interested in developments in Eastern and Central Europe than it was in developments in Western Europe. These concerns had less to do with French worries about the Federal Republic's well-being and more to do with Western Europe's well-being and France's own sense of security. It was a vicious circle whereby France both feared losing West Germany's strong political economic weight while also fearing that the Federal Republic might abandon its commitment to the strengthening of the European community. Within months, France's double anxiety would be given good reason for existing. Very soon, France would find itself demanding to keep Germany as small as possible without any talk of unification. Ultimately, Germany drifted westward in its geopolitical orientation then, just as it has now historiographically become part of a Western narrative. That is to say, very quickly the GDR went from being part of the autumn revolutions of the peoples, a phrase often used as a reference to the 1848 springtime of the peoples, to becoming a standalone entity. And yet there's a larger international context here that influenced whose revolution this was. The famous demonstration chants of Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, that later turned to Wir sind ein Volk, we are one people, have become a stand-in for all aspects of civil courage in the GDR. I do not mean to play down those actions here. On the other hand, the folk were demonstrating within a very specific international context that involves political actors, groups as well as individuals. Perhaps the best example of the myopia with which the fall of the Berlin Wall has been viewed is a recent statement from a policy analyst that the fall of the Berlin Wall began with its building in 1961, end quote. No, it did not. What did happen in 1961 was that the wall allowed for a sense of relief in some circles, especially that the question of losing colleagues and friends to the West seemed to have been resolved, and this was particularly true in art circles such as the film industry. But there was also a sudden sense of panic in some political circles that the GDR had lost some of its raison d'etre with the wall. Before the wall, it had needed to protect itself from the West. With the wall, it became just another Soviet satellite. It is here that we see Honecker struggling with the GDR's self-identity, including to spying on its brother countries such as Czechoslovakia and trying to be more Soviet than the Soviets. This latter attitude would be his downfall. More realistically, the possibility of the fall of the wall began with upheavals in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. Solidarity in Poland, the creation of an opposition roundtable in Hungary, the first semi-free elections in Poland, a crumbling Soviet Union economy, the opening of Austrian and Hungarian borders, and although often overlooked, the Tiananmen Square demonstrations and the Chinese government's violent repression of democratic movements in Beijing, a reaction that Honecker applauded as appropriate for putting down reactionary forces. In other words, GDR politicians looked at what was happening around them, revolutions throughout Asia, Europe, and Latin America, let us not forget, and ignored to their peril the lessons to be learned. In terms of the domestic context, we have some interesting perceptions there as well that need to be reconsidered. Although newspapers in the 1980s far and wide reported that the standard of living in East Berlin had surpassed that of the average worker living in London, these claims turned out to be incredibly misleading, in fact false. The GDR had been propped up by the West German government for so long that it was difficult to find where one balance sheet ended and the other began. This was done in the form of attractive import-export arrangements, subsidizing in multiple areas, etc. That is to say that West Germany has essentially always been bankrolling East Germany to some degree or another. Still, this arrangement benefited the average GDR citizen, even if London did look better. It was not just access to West German television that gave East Germans a desire for commodities. It was living in the GDR itself. Using a number of indices such as available housing and disposable income, East Germans lived at a higher standard of living than many of their Eastern neighbors, and was a role model, for instance, in other countries' housing projects, including India. Yet they compared themselves to the Federal Republic instead of their Eastern brethren, wanting more and better of what they themselves had, because West and East Germany's special relationship allowed for so much of this stuff to be present. It was the Cold War problem with racing for superiority. In the German context, it meant only for the East to be as good as the West, thus presupposing what constituted superior as a normative Western system of values and consumerism. So against this background, even caught off guard at the quickly changing developments, the West was already a relatively stable partner in policy decisions when international context began to affect domestic contexts. Let me give an example. When vacationing East Berliners breached the wall of Bonn's embassy in Prague and demanded asylum, Honecker believed that other socialist countries, as well as the Federal Republic, were betraying him and previous treaties and agreements. When Bonn arranged for the so-called freedom trains to transport these East Germans to the Federal Republic, Honecker agreed as long as they passed through the GDR, Dresden to be specific. Honecker believed that the symbolic demonstration of what he saw as expatriation and betrayal would forever shame those inside the trains for their cowardice at leaving their home. Instead, riots broke out when East Germans watching the trains realized they would not be able to board them. Honecker missed this cue, believing that the country was better off without such dissidents. At this moment, Bonn appeared to Honecker as the ideal place to send away unhappy GDR citizens without realizing that the welcoming end of the train rides would result in a strengthened perception of the West as a haven. Honecker did not see this as a revolution in his own country, a fitting example of Gorbachev's warning to him that whoever comes too late will be punished by history. Wer zu spät kommt, dem bestraft die Geschichte. Meanwhile, Prague had suffered through this international dilemma, and with Bonn warned away further asylum seekers from Czechoslovakia, a topic that needs considerable more research thanks to, than just a mere thanks to Prague for helping out those Germans. Then there is the question of the quick unification. On November 4th, the West German weekly Der Spiegel had already asked whether the GDR could even be saved, a question taken up by numerous other individuals and groups in East and West, including literary critics. Given the amount of money that the Federal Republic had been investing in the GDR to keep it stable, quick calculations made it clear that not even West Germany's robust economy could keep the GDR afloat. It could, however, afford unification, so that the Federal Republic's rich coffers became an ethical mandate to help East Germany, frankly, to not go through the clear fates of other Eastern European countries. On November 28th, Kohl presented the Bundestag with a 10-point plan that had been drafted by his advisor Horst Teltschik and further modified by the Chancellor's closest confidants. In essence, Kohl had to sell unification to his country, and I think this point is often overlooked. For all the optimism and joy that the Berlin Wall was open, West Germans were not united in their desire to continue welcoming waves of East German immigrants and feared for their own country's stability. Despite many myths to the contrary, Kohl wanted to move slowly but surely. But Bonn was left with few choices, and domestic circumstances pushed him to move faster than even his 10-point plan foresaw. He wanted to be the unification chancellor. This much is certain. That meant that the CDU needed to be in charge of bringing together these two countries instead of the opposition party of the Social Democrats. When Kohl announced in what I believe was an empty political statement that it was now time to reconsider the Oder-Neisse border as well, international politics and domestic politics aligned against this kind of statement that other countries feared. In this sense, I often wonder why unification did not happen sooner in order for Germany to maintain good, or at least good enough, relationships with other countries. But I think that by then the revolution had taken on enough speed to push its ownership onto both everyone and no one. Returning to the question of whose revolution in conclusion, I went to look at this in a historiographical context. Germans retained considerable interest in its eastern neighbors through approximately 1991, at which point it became intent on solving its own problems, and stories about Central and Eastern Europe moved to the back pages of newspapers. We can hardly blame Germany for such self-preoccupation, but we can question the effect. 1989 became Germany's revolution, and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collective consciousness of both East and West German, and remains so today. And if you happen to look at November 9th on Google and the US or the German site that had a video of the Berlin Wall falling. So this has really become the emblem of the people's revolutions of the autumn. And everything else has been forgotten. More troubling, though, is that this remains the fact for historians of modern Germany as well, which has led this discussion to being about East Germany as a revolutionary country to being shut out of the narrative of Central and Eastern Europeans' revolutions. It is difficult to find more than a brief mention of the GDR in comparative studies of 1989, especially in the past 10 years, just as it is difficult to find more than a brief reference to other countries and studies of the fall of the Berlin Wall in publications about German history. East Germany has become its own entity under the historian's pen, belonging neither to Central and Eastern Europe nor to Western Europe historically or geopolitically. We have, at the cost of a great loss to history, written the GDR into a corner where it has been relatively satisfied to be the star of attention for what is actually a number of few scholars. I am not suggesting that we all sit down and write only comparative histories of 1989 and abandon national histories, or that we blame politicians and historians for this development and how we think about that period. I do suggest, though, that we look for more modest solutions. We should first begin to acknowledge that the GDR's special status in the historiography does neither historians nor the scholarship a favor. And I mean this in many contexts. Try being a historian of East Germany today and looking for a job for Western Europe or Eastern Europe. You're not welcome in either candidate pool. We then need to find more venues like this one for further discussions of comparisons and contexts that have the possibility of moving into mainstream venues beyond our own region's typical publications. Revolutions are never owned by one group, and as historians we should not be bound by nations or historians before us who have answered the question of whose revolution too narrowly. Thank you.